Please open your Bibles to James chapter 4. This will be our passage for this morning. James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. James 4, starting in verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. This passage, I think, speaks to the situation many of us find us in. This kind of uncertainty about the future, the uncertainty about today, and how we live in a state of uncertainty. The truth is that I have taken this sermon and changed it, tweaked it, updated it, because this is actually the sermon that I had prepared for the last time we were about to meet before everything happened. And as everything was unfolding, I thought, I had kind of questioned, should I do this sermon discussing about the uncertainty of tomorrow, or is now the time to do a sermon to encourage us, because I wasn't sure when we would meet again. And I made the decision to do an encouraging sermon. But I still have now been thinking about this sermon, and as I said, since then I've changed it and I've updated it. But it struck me that this sermon speaks so much to where we are right now. And I had originally prepared it right before we were about to meet last. And I think it's important to point out that there's a reason why a passage like this, there's a reason why these verses can speak to us today. I mean, have you ever taken a moment to consider that passages written, nearly 2,000 years ago still ring true in our everyday life? And that's because this passage is pointing out not just something for a particular situation. He's pointing out something that is universally true. Something that is true across time, across geography, that is true of all people, in all situations. These are things we all must consider, and that they stand out and speak to us no matter who we are and no matter where we are. This is a universal truth. And it's hard to talk about universal truths today. Many are just not interested in universal truths. Many don't even believe that there is such a thing as universal truths. But I think the fact that we can read a passage like this and believe it, understand it, identify with it, speaks to the fact that there are such things as universal truths. It is true that we do not know what today will bring or tomorrow will bring. It is true that our lives are vapors. And it is true that there are really these two different responses that the author points out. Now, you may be able to think of other responses that the author doesn't discuss, but the two he points out are the two that I want to discuss this morning. And one is to view the present and the future with arrogance, and one is to view the present and the future with humility. Because this is what I think the author gives us with. You have this notion of people, he says in verse 16, boasting in their arrogance. And instead, we ought to be people who are humble. That is to say, people who are realistic about who we are, about how brief our lives are, and how we ought to live in light of God and living a life that is described here rightly as a mist or a vapor. So first I want to discuss what it means to be arrogant about the future. And we have to first pause and realize as we build into this idea of arrogance, that we are creatures who plan things. We're planning creatures. We have ideas about the future, about who we're going to be in the future and what the future holds for me. And sometimes we have these really big plans. We have plans to go travel. We have plans to, get married, have children, to buy a house. We have plans to take up a business, go and start it, go sell it. We have plans to retire. We have big plans. Or sometimes we have small plans. Like I plan on maybe going grocery shopping this week. Or I plan on seeing the doctor this week. Whether they're big plans or whether they're small plans, it should be noted that we're planning creatures. We like to plan. We like to know what is coming. We like to have expectations about what is coming so that we can react appropriately and not be taken off guard. And this is something that's not new. It's not new in American society. People have always been planning creatures. People have always wanted to know what is the future going to hold. Right? This is why there were not only prophets, but there were false prophets in the Old Testament. Because people were so desperate to know what's going to happen in the future that they looked to anyone who would tell them something. And we're really not that different today. We might not have false prophets walking around in the city streets, although if you go to some big cities, there are those kinds of people. We just don't take them seriously. But there are certain people that I think we treat very similarly. Maybe people who know economics, who can tell us what the future holds about our money, about what kind of stocks are worth investing in now. What is Warren Buffett doing? Does he know the future? Is he the one who's planning for it? Can he see something that we can't see? You see, this idea of this yearning and this desperation to know the future is not new. We have our own prophets today. We have our own people who others think they know what's coming. And we can look to them. It's just now we have charts and we have graphs, and we say, well, this is probably what's going to happen in the future. Because we're planning creatures. And we want to know what the future holds. And this is not anything new. This is something that people have been doing for a very long time. But there's something that throws a wrench into all of this. We're planning creatures, but there's something that just messes everything up in our plans, and that's the brevity of life. How brief it is. The uncertainty of life. And that's what James here is speaking about. Verse 14, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. See, one of the problems with being creatures who make plans is these two things. That one, life is brief, and two, life is uncertain. Our lives are brief lives. They're lives that on one moment we have them, and in the next moment we're gone. Lives that just pass us by before we even realize what's happened. Life is brief. And that makes planning very difficult. Because at any moment our lives can end. At any moment, all that we've built up in this world can be taken from us. And our lives are not only brief, but our lives are uncertain. We can't foresee what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. We like certainty. That is the foundation for making plans, is that things in the future will largely resemble what's going on right now. And as we've seen over the last couple of months, life is uncertain. No one saw this coming. Life is uncertain. And you can't count on the future being the same as the present. You can't count on your circumstances being the same. You can't count on even being alive to see your plans through. So we have this desire to plan, but there's an uncertainty in these plans based on our circumstances, based on the brevity of life. And it's because we have this uncertainty in these plans that then we can understand what James is talking about, because it's an odd thing, isn't it? That James here in verse 16 says, "As it is, you boast in your arrogance." What's arrogant about making plans? I mean, here we actually have to stop and just take a moment. Does this mean it's wrong to make any plans of any kind? Well, no, it's not, because even James actually describes in verse 15 someone who is still making plans. Someone who says, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. So it's not wrong to make any plans at all. That's not wrong. That's not arrogant to make plans, because in verse 15, James instructs us how to be people who make plans. But there are a couple ways that plan making can be wrong and can be arrogant. One is that we end up relying on our plans more than God. Or maybe we become so distracted by our plans that we lose sight of God. That can easily happen to us. That we get so caught up in our plans, what's going to happen, that we just lose sight of God. Kind of, in the fog of the mistiness, the haziness of all the plans we have for today, for tomorrow, for the next week, for the next month, God just kind of gets pushed out of it. And I think therein really can lie the arrogance, because it means a couple things. One, it means we believe that God can't stop our plans. That's arrogant. To think that God cannot stop plans that I've made. It's also arrogant to think that I make these plans and God has to see them through because I know God totally and completely. Right? I know who God is. God can't surprise me, and I can make plans that must be fulfilled according to who God is. That's arrogant. Who are we to think that we know God inside and out as if we know him better than he knows himself? It's also arrogant to think that I have the power to make my plans happen. That I alone, based on my own will, based on my own abilities, I have the power to make this plan happen, and God can't do anything about it, right? That's arrogance. And so James warns us against arrogance in plan making, and I really want to emphasize plan making in and of itself is not wrong, because like I said in verse 15, he still gives us someone who makes plans. But it's when we're arrogant about our plans that God can't stop us. Who can get in the way? We can accomplish anything, right? That is the Tower of Babel, is it not? This idea that we can build something that God can't stop us from building. We're going to build this city. I mean, that's what Babel was, really this city that they were going to build. And God struck down this tower that they were building. So there is a wrong way to follow through on plans, and that is to do so with arrogance. Because to do so with arrogance, we really don't rely on God. Let's just take a moment and think about who God is and how he has demonstrated himself to be. God has demonstrated himself to be someone who can do things that we can't predict. God says this multiple times through the prophets. I'm doing something that you would not believe even if someone were to tell you. A part of who God is he can do the unpredictable. No one can foresee it. So how are we supposed to make plans in light of God being unpredictable? Because if you think God is predictable, that's arrogance, thinking we know God inside and out. We don't just acknowledge that God can do things that are unpredictable, right? Things into which even angels long to look. But we rely on it. We count on it. We count on God being who he has declared himself to be. And he has declared himself to be unpredictable, to be able to do things no one could have foreseen. We rely on God to be someone who is just. Right? We count on that. And I think that's an important thing to take into account when it comes to our plans and our plan making, that God, you can count on God giving people what they deserve. That's really what justice is in a nutshell. God is a just God. You can count on that. You can count on God telling the truth when it comes to the brevity of life. You know, in order to be people who make plans, we have to actually rely on the fact that we may not live to see them through. Because that actually is relying on God. That is relying on God being who he has demonstrated himself to be and the promises he has made, especially as we've seen here in this passage. If it's true that our life is a vapor, if it's true that we don't know what tomorrow will bring, then we must count on that. And not to count on it is actually a kind of arrogance. So there are these two different ways of approaching, I think, the present and the future. One is a way of arrogance. One is a way that says my plans must come about. No one can stop them. I have the power to see them through, even though the whole world gets in my way. But there's another way that we can approach our plans, and it's one of humility. And I want to pause a moment and explain what humility is, because this is sometimes a very misunderstood concept. That being humble and humility, as we see in Scripture, is not the idea of, putting ourselves down or thinking too little of ourselves. It's really being realistic and being honest about who we are and our capabilities. So if I'm someone who, let's say, plays basketball well, and someone comes up to me and says, hey, you're a really good basketball player. Being humble is not saying, no, I'm not, even though I secretly know I am. Right? That's not being humble. That's actually lying. That's not telling the truth. If someone says that to me, I just say, thank you, or you give God the glory. God has given me this talent. See, being humble is acknowledging and being honest about who we are and our capabilities and our situations really in light of God. And so I want to stress this, that we are to have humility. That is, we are to be honest and realistic about our plans in order to be someone who makes plans in a humble way. We are to be people who acknowledge, as verse 14 does, we don't know what tomorrow will bring. That's just a truth that I don't know that. That's realistic. I don't know if I'm going to be alive tomorrow. In fact, look at what James says in verse 13, come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will do these things. It's not just that I don't know if I'll be alive tomorrow. I don't even know what's going to happen at the end of today. And when I honestly reflect on that, That's a humble approach to making plans about our present and our future. I don't know what's going to happen at the end of today. I don't know if I'm going to survive the drive home after this service has ended. I just don't know. We don't know if our plans are going to come about, and so we're realistic about them. We say, as verse 15 does, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Here you have this really interesting notion. If you don't pay careful attention, you might miss it. The goal is not to be a person who does not make plans. We are allowed to make plans. The goal is to merge our plans with the will of God, and to understand that God's will always overrides my plans. Always. Always overrides my plans. There's no getting around that. We submit to the will of God because we trust God to be who he has declared himself to be. He has declared himself to be trustworthy. He has declared himself to be someone who has our best interest in mind, even when our plans don't come about. He is someone who says no to our plans out of love, even if we don't see it, even if we never know the answer. We can trust on that and count on that. I want you to notice what James says here in verse 15. He says, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, and then he actually says two separate things. First he says, if the Lord wills, we will live. That's a hard mindset, I think, to be in. To be in all the time. I don't know if you could actually live in that mindset 100% of your time every day. If the Lord wills, we will live. That our very lives we submit them to the will of God. As I said, he doesn't just talk about tomorrow in verse 13. He even talks about today. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a city. We don't know what even the end of the day will bring. But if the Lord wills, I will live even to see this evening. Now, like I said, he actually says two things. If the Lord wills, first, we will live. And if the Lord wills, we will do this or that. We submit first our lives to the will of God, and then our plans to the will of God. Because if you try to submit your plans to the will of God without submitting your lives to the will of God, we've got things out of order. And we're really not then submitting our plans to the will of God. I think the order here is actually very important, that we first submit our lives to the will of God in order to submit our plans and our expectations about the present and the future to the will of God. So you have this two different accounts here. First, of those who live in arrogance about their plans and their expectations of the present and the future. People who think they can proclaim what's coming. People who think, as many do today, if we have the right charts and the right graphs, this is what is going to happen. No one knows. It's an arrogant view to think that God cannot stop our plans. But we also have a view of humility. A view not of people who don't make plans, but of people who submit their lives and their plans to the will of God, who are realistic and honest with ourselves. And we acknowledge there is sin in this world. I will die. There may very well come a time when no one on earth remembers my name. We submit our lives to the will of God, and we're honest and realistic about who we are, about our plans, about the things that we expect in the present and in the future. James caps this off then with verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. I think it's interesting that he kind of just puts this in here. And he begins it with with the word so, or therefore, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And I think it's an important verse to keep all of this in mind, because James is very interested in how we act, how we behave, and why we behave the way we do. I think you see this throughout his epistle. Very interested in why we behave the way we do. And one of the reasons why we behave the way we do is because we live according to the things we believe to be true, or at least we ought to. So, for example, if I believe that running a red light, I will get into a car wreck if I run a red light, I live according to that. I live according to the truth that I should not run red lights. I actually live that out. And I think in the same way, James here has given us some things that we must keep in mind for how we live. That we don't boast in our plans for the future or even for the rest of today. But instead we live in humility. That is, we live honestly. That our lives are vapors. They can be taken from us at any moment. And that God does not have to make sure our plans come about. And we submit all of this to the will of God. And James doesn't just give us information in verses 13 through 16. He gives us knowledge that he now expects us to live by. And I think it's important to understand this isn't just something that James does. This is all of Scripture. It's not just information that we consider and we think about. It's knowledge that we take in and we digest and we live it out. So James, I think in verse 17, is saying, now that you know this, you have a responsibility to do it. And so whoever knows the right thing to do, which is what he's just told us. He's just told us the right thing to do. Don't make these enormous plans and expect to live them out apart from God. Now that you know, you have a responsibility. I think that's how verse 17 really fits into this and caps it off in a very meaningful way. He says, whoever knows the right thing to do, which is everything he's just told us here, and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That there is now this personal accountability based on what I know to be true. I know now that it is arrogant to live my life as if there's an infinite supply of it, before we reach eternity, let's say. It is arrogant to live as if God cannot stop my plans. And if you take this and think about it, I think you'll see that much of the world does live this way. Even in the midst of what we're going through now, even in the midst of uncertainty, there are people who still live in this kind of arrogance and still live with this kind of certainty that their plans will come through. But as God's people, we're not to live that way. It's not to say we never make plans. It's that we understand that we submit our lives and our plans to the will of God. At this time, we always want to offer an invitation that if there's a way in your life that you are disconnected from God, something that has come between you and God, whatever that is, now is the time to take care of it. Because as James says, you don't know what even the rest of today will bring. Now is the time to be right with God. Now is the time to call on him and to seek his face. And if there's any way we can assist you in that, we ask that you would talk to us or even come forward now as we'll stand and sing the invitation song.